June 1944. The sky over northern Italy was silent before the storm. At 8,000 meters, the Messerschmitts began to dive. A ritual of survival they had trusted for 2 long years. Below them, the P-38 Lightnings followed. But this time, they didn't stop at 420 miles an hour. No shaking, no buffeting, no loss of control. As the Luftwaffe waited for the familiar sound of wings tearing apart, the Lightnings kept falling, steady, precise, and locked on their prey. In that moment, every German tactic dissolved into disbelief. A small piece of metal, no bigger than a hand, the dive recovery flap, had turned their only escape into a deadly trap. This is the story of how Lockheed saved the Lightning from its fatal curse, and how a simple engineering fix changed the course of air combat in 1944. Northern Italy. The summer air shimmered above the Alps, yet the sky was not peaceful. For both sides, it had become a chessboard of attrition. Fuel, altitude, and fear were the only currencies left. At 1400 hours on June 9th, Oberleutnant Hans Müller of Jagdgeschwader 53 spotted the silver flashes of approaching aircraft, twin-boom silhouettes that every German pilot recognized instantly. The P-38 Lightning. To him, they were dangerous but predictable enemies. He knew their weakness, and for 2 years that knowledge had kept him alive. Since late 1942, Luftwaffe pilots had learned to escape the Lightning's pursuit simply by diving. Beyond 420 miles per hour, the American fighter would begin to tremble violently, its elevators locking in place as compressibility seized control of the aircraft. At those speeds, physics became the German pilot's ally. Müller smiled beneath his oxygen mask. He had used that escape 17 times. The numbers were always the same. Dive, hold, and watch. The Lightning break away in helpless fear. By 1943, this weakness had become doctrine. German flight schools in occupied France taught new recruits how to exploit it. The correct angle, the right throttle setting, the speed limit of the American aircraft. Major Wilhelm Steinmann, commander of 2JG-53, even wrote a manual describing the P-38's failure point. Violent tail buffeting at 515 kilometers per hour, followed by a nose-down pitch that no human strength could overcome. To the Luftwaffe, it was more than a tactic. It was a psychological shield. They might be outnumbered, but as long as they could dive away, they believed they could never be cornered. The phenomenon, compressibility, had turned science itself into a German weapon. And for nearly 2 years, it worked flawlessly. Far from Europe, Japanese naval pilots in the Solomon Islands had learned the same truth. When the twin-boom fighters of the U.S. Army Air Forces appeared over the Pacific, 0 pilots would perform a split S and dive steeply away. Each time, the Americans would break off, unwilling to follow. In Tokyo, Lieutenant Commander Fuchidome wrote in his combat report, "The American twin-engine fighter cannot survive its own speed." Even Admiral Yamamoto reviewed that report, just days before his fateful encounter with the very same aircraft over Bougainville. From the Mediterranean to the Pacific, the P-38's flaw was universal knowledge, a weakness written into the very metal of its wings. In southern Italy, Lightning squadrons of the 15th Air Force were running out of patience. Every day they escorted bomber streams toward the refineries at Ploiești, and every day they watched Messerschmitts dive away untouched. Captain James Austin wrote in his combat diary, "Watching them vanish below is like fighting with one hand tied behind your back." His wingman, Lieutenant William Capron, described it more simply. At 400 miles an hour, the plane starts to scream, and you pray it doesn't kill you before the Germans do. By mid-1944, morale among Lightning pilots was dangerously low. The aircraft that had once symbolized American innovation was now viewed as a death trap above 25,000 feet. At Lockheed's Burbank facility, Clarence Kelly Johnson refused to give up, the man who had designed the Lightning. a revolutionary twin-boom interceptor capable of outrunning anything in 1940, now found himself cornered by a problem that physics itself had written into his design. Compressibility wasn't just turbulence. It was the sound barrier, whispering its warning years before pilots even understood what Mach numbers meant. When air flowed too fast over the P-38's thick wings, shock waves formed, shifting pressure backward and forcing the nose down. Wind tunnel tests were almost impossible. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, refused to run models at full speed, afraid the shock waves might destroy their expensive tunnels. Johnson begged, argued, and finally went around them, testing scale models secretly at Lockheed's own facilities. What he needed wasn't brute force, it was a new balance of pressure. In early 1943, test pilot Tony LeVier took off in an experimental P-38 equipped with something strange. 2 small panels under the wings, just outboard of the engines. When deployed, they didn't act as brakes. They shifted the center of lift forward, giving the pilot control again in high-speed dives. They called them dive recovery flaps. They deployed in 1.5 seconds, angled downward by 35 degrees. Simple, elegant, mechanical, and they worked. LeVier tested them at 25,000 feet. He dove vertically. The airspeed indicator passed 540 miles per hour. The Lightning remained smooth, perfectly controllable. When he landed, the ground crews thought they had witnessed a miracle. He laughed and said, "Gentlemen, this is how we make physics behave." By late 1943, Lockheed had produced 200 retrofit kits to send overseas. Each could turn a doomed P-38 into a survivor, but fate intervened. In March 1944, the Douglas C-54 transport, carrying all 200 kits to England, was mistakenly shot down by a Royal Air Force fighter, misidentified as a German Condor. The entire shipment burned in the North Atlantic. For 3 more months, P-38 pilots in Europe would die flying aircraft that could have been saved. Kelly Johnson called it a tragedy measured in seconds. June 9, 1944. At an airfield in southern Italy, maintenance crews worked under floodlights, installing dive flaps on 12 P-38J models using spare parts and improvised wiring. Among the pilots was Lieutenant Colonel Jack Jenkins, who personally test flew each modified Lightning that night. At dawn, 96 Lightnings of the 1st and 82nd Fighter Groups prepared for another escort mission. They didn't know that this day would rewrite everything they thought they knew about their aircraft. Far to the north, Hans Müller was briefing his men at Wels, Austria. Confident that any P-38 could be outdived, as always, the Germans had no idea that for the first time, the Americans were bringing a weapon that wasn't a gun, but an idea. At 9:47 over the Danube River Valley, the formations met. Müller led 4 Messerschmitts into a textbook bounce attack, firing on a trailing Lightning and watching it explode into flame. Then, as always, he nosed over into a 40-degree dive. The airspeed climbed 400, 450, 500 miles per hour. He waited for the P-38s to break off. They didn't. Captain Robin Olds, flying his P-38JS CAT-3, rolled inverted and followed. At 480 miles per hour, he flipped the red-guarded switch on his left console. The flaps deployed with a faint metallic thump. No buffeting, no loss of control. The Lightning stayed solid, slicing through the dive like a blade. Olds closed the distance. 600 meters. 400. 200. Müller looked over his shoulder in disbelief. For the first time in 2 years, the devil's fork-tail shadow did not fade away. It grew larger. In that instant, the Luftwaffe's most trusted escape vanished. Not with an explosion, but with a sound they could not hear. The hum of 2 electric motors extending a flap. Radio intercepts recorded that morning captured fragments of panic. "Sie folgen uns! Sie stürzen weiter!" They're still diving. To the Germans, it was impossible. To the Americans, it was liberation. For the first time, Lightning pilots could chase without fear. They could push beyond the limits that had haunted them since 1942. As Olds and his men pulled out of the dive, the air over the Danube carried both triumph and disbelief. The moment when human engineering finally tamed the invisible wall between control and chaos. When the surviving Luftwaffe pilots returned to base, their combat reports were filled with confusion. The P-38 maintained pursuit through impossible speeds. Compressibility appears to no longer affect them. German technical officers dismissed it as exaggeration, but then more reports came in. The pattern was undeniable. Within weeks, the Luftwaffe's tactical manuals, written on the foundation of escape by dive, were obsolete. The sky itself had changed sides. For the first time in the war, the United States had not just matched Germany in the air. It had out-engineered them. The P-38 Lightning, once mocked as a flawed design, was reborn as the symbol of American ingenuity under pressure. The turning point had begun not with firepower, but with a quiet click under the pilot's left hand. A signal that the age of improvisation was over and the age of calculated dominance had begun. June 10, 1944. The airfields of southern Italy came alive before dawn. Pilots strapped into their cockpits without realizing they were about to rewrite air combat forever. For the 1st and 82nd Fighter Groups, the orders were routine. Escort bombers striking oil refineries in Romania. But 12 of their P-38Js carried something no German radar could detect: the new dive recovery flaps. To the mechanics who had worked through the night installing them, it was a gamble. Improvised wiring, no manuals, and no time. To the pilots, it was a whisper of hope. When the engines roared to life, the sound was ordinary. But this mission would end every German assumption about the Lightning. At 9:47 hours, radar screens in Austria flared with new blips. 96 Lightnings in their bomber formation crossed the Adriatic, heading toward Ploiești. Luftwaffe controllers scrambled interceptors from Jagdgeschwader 53 and Jagdgeschwader 77. Hans Müller, the ace of 17 victories, led his four-ship element from above the clouds. He dove at the bombers with the calm of experience. Confident that no Lightning could follow his retreat, his guns flared. A P-38 exploded. He rolled and dove again, muscle memory guiding every motion. 400, 450, 500 miles an hour. He waited for the familiar moment when pursuit broke off, but this time it didn't. When he looked back, he saw a silver shape closing fast. Steady, unshaken, impossible. Robin Old's P-38S CAT-3 was still there. Muller's mind rejected what his eyes confirmed. The Americans were still in control. He pulled harder. The Messerschmitt shuddered. Olds held firm, closing to within 200 yards. Machine guns flashed. Muller's canopy exploded. He barely escaped by dropping into the valley below. For him, it wasn't just defeat. It was the death of physics as he understood it. Intercepted radio traffic told the story. Sie fahren weiter. Sie halten Kontrolle. They're still diving. They have control. The phrase spread like a virus through German frequencies. In that instant, the Luftwaffe's last reliable tactic disintegrated. No altitude was safe, no dive deep enough. Later that day, ground controllers received frantic calls from multiple squadrons, fighters breaking formation, desperate to climb away from pursuing Lightnings. But climbing no longer guaranteed survival. The Americans could now attack from any direction. At Luftwaffe headquarters, disbelief turned to denial. General Adolf Galland refused to accept the reports. He demanded proof. Gun camera footage, wreckage, data. When the film from a damaged Bf-109 arrived, it showed what words could not explain. A P-38 in controlled pursuit, both aircraft exceeding 500 miles per hour. The Lightning remained stable while the Messerschmitt trembled on the edge of destruction. For the first time, German command realized their physics advantage had vanished. and with it, their morale. Across Europe, Luftwaffe training schools began revising manuals, removing the once sacred instruction, when pursued by a lightning, dive steeply to escape. Pilots laughed bitterly at the new directive. Without their trusted maneuver, they were left naked. Flight surgeons reported cases of insomnia, tremors, and dive paralysis. Young recruits refused to exceed 450 kilometers per hour in training. Veterans called the new P-38 the ghost that follows. It wasn't the hardware that defeated them. It was fear itself. With confidence restored, U.S. commanders shifted tactics. P-38 squadrons were no longer passive escorts. They became hunters. Lightning pilots began using the same physics once used against them, initiating steep dives to build overwhelming speed. Now it was the Germans who broke off. Over northern Italy, Lieutenant William Caprone dove after a fleeing WW2 his lightning screaming past 480 miles per hour. He flipped the red switch, the flaps deployed, and the chaos vanished. The aircraft leveled smoothly, its guns locked on target. Caprone's kill was recorded as first confirmed dive pursuit victory. His combat log simply read, "Flaps saved me," and ended him. Back in Burbank, Kelly Johnson finally received word, "Flaps effective in combat." Problem solved. He didn't celebrate. Instead, he spent the night alone in his office, reading casualty reports from the previous months. He knew exactly what solved had cost. Hundreds of pilots, thousands of families, and 14 months of delay that might have been prevented. Johnson later said, "Engineering is not victory. It's a race against death." By mid-1944, Lockheed turned its assembly lines into a war of speed. Workers modified hundreds of existing P-38s in open air, on the factory ramp, in the rain, under floodlights. A sign hung above the production line. "Every flap you install saves a man who hasn't died yet." The last 210 P-38 J-25LO models rolled out with dive flaps built in. Each one marked a step closer to restoring the Lightning's reputation and America's dominance in the skies. The Germans couldn't keep up. Their factories were bombed, their research fragmented, their engineers scattered. The Luftwaffe's tactical advantage, once rooted in science, was buried beneath the rubble of its own laboratories. By August 1944, the transformation was complete. American intelligence began dropping leaflets over German airfields. On each was a drawing of a P-38 pursuing a Bf-109 straight into the ground, and the words, "Your dive won't save you anymore." The effect was devastating. German pilots began avoiding engagements with Lightning formations altogether. Requests for transfers increased. Squadrons deliberately chose cloud cover to avoid being spotted. The hunters had become the hunted. The 474th Fighter Group, equipped entirely with dive flap Lightnings, recorded a kill ratio of 4-1 by September. American commanders noted that Lightning units had regained their aggressiveness. They no longer feared speed, they used it as a weapon. Colonel Clinton Wassam, their commander, wrote, "The flaps gave us more than control, they gave us courage." That courage spread quickly. P-38 pilots began experimenting with vertical attack patterns, launching from higher altitudes and diving through entire enemy formations. Before pulling out with precision no German could match, air superiority was no longer a contest of numbers. It had become a contest of ideas, and America was now leading. The success of dive recovery flaps reached beyond the P-38. Engineers from Republic and North American studied the modification and implemented similar systems on the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51H Mustang. For the first time, American aircraft could safely operate near the transonic region, a realm once reserved for disaster. At NACA's Ames Laboratory, researchers began compiling the data gathered from combat. Their reports would form the foundation of high-speed aerodynamics. and directly influenced post-war jet designs. The Lightning's suffering had become science. By the end of summer 1944, the change was measurable. Luftwaffe loss rates skyrocketed. Their escape tactics were obsolete. Their morale shattered. In contrast, the 15th Air Force reported record success. P-38 now pursued targets from altitude, outdiving, outclimbing, and outlasting their German counterparts. One after-action report summarized it perfectly. The enemy's last defense was not his guns, it was gravity. We took that away. Yet behind every improvement lay a quiet truth. Progress was written in blood. Pilots who had once cursed the Lightning's flaws now praised it as the most forgiving aircraft they had ever flown. But many of them had learned that lesson too late. When Major Harold Fisher's P-38 went down the day before the first flaps were deployed, his death became a symbol inside every squadron. The mechanics began calling the new modification Fisher's Wings. Each time a pilot flipped the switch, he knew whose memory was guiding his hand. By autumn, the Luftwaffe's airfields lay silent. Fuel shortages grounded many squadrons. The few remaining fighters faced enemies that no longer respected the laws of drag and fear. Operation Market Garden in September and Bodenplatte on New Year's Day, 1945, proved the point that the Lightning could dive, pursue, and climb again before its enemies could even recover. The war in the air was over long before Berlin fell. The final blow had not been delivered by bombs, but by the engineers who refused to accept that physics was immutable. The turning point of 1944 was not about altitude or speed. It was about understanding. The P-38's dive recovery flaps were a small solution to a large problem, but they represented something far greater, the moment when humanity began to control not just machines, but the very air that surrounded them. In every Lightning that returned home, you could hear it. The quiet click of two metal plates deploying, marking the instant when fear became mastery. The Luftwaffe's era of certainty had ended, and from that silence, a new kind of warfare was born. One defined not by luck, but by learning. By July 1944, the air over Europe carried a different kind of silence. Not the calm before combat, but the emptiness that followed it. Across Luftwaffe bases from northern Italy to Austria, the same rumors spread. Lightning fighters were no longer breaking off. Their dives, once fatal, had become flawless. For 2 years, every German pilot had lived by one rule. If a P-38 is on your tail, dive. Now that rule was gone, and with it went their faith in physics, in training, in survival. The war in the air was no longer fought against men. It was fought against inevitability. At Wels Airfield, Austria, flight instructors tore pages from their manuals. The section titled Split S Evade, Guaranteed Escape, was now useless. One officer scrawled in the margin, "Do not attempt, they follow now." But he didn't know what to replace it with. There was no new tactic, no countermeasure. Every path led down, and now the Americans followed even there. Inside the mess halls, silence replaced laughter. Pilots stared at the walls, their cigarettes burning to ash. They no longer feared death. They feared inevitability. The medical logs tell their own story. In July, Luftwaffe physicians began recording dive trauma among their pilots. Dreams of endless falling, of being chased through a dive that never ended. Feldwebel Ernst Düring, 20 years old, wrote in his diary, "I dove as always, 500 kilometers per hour, 600, waiting for the shaking. It never came. The noise was different. Then light filled my cockpit. That's all I remember." He was found 2 days later, his parachute torn, his aircraft shattered. But what killed him wasn't the Lightning. It was disbelief. The human mind could not accept that its one law of escape had vanished overnight. On the Allied side, a different kind of fear had ended. Lieutenant William Capron, the same pilot who once refused to dive beyond 400 miles per hour, now pushed his Lightning into the abyss. He later said, "When the shaking started, I hit the switch." The world went silent. I was falling faster than ever, but the aircraft felt alive. The transformation was psychological as much as mechanical. Pilots who had once dreaded speed now sought it out. The dive had become not a death sentence, but a weapon, a test of courage and precision. The P-38 had learned to fall, and in doing so, it learned to dominate. Lockheed's engineers back home calculated the cost of hesitation. 14 months delay in deployment, 300 aircraft, 400 lives. Kelly Johnson read those numbers in silence. He knew each one had a name. He told his colleague Ward Beeman, "If we had found this sooner, how many of them would still be here?" Innovation, he realized, was not about discovery. It was about time, and the time they lost was measured in blood. At Rechlin Test Center, Luftwaffe scientists examined the wreckage of a captured P-38. Under its wing, they found the strange new appendages, small aluminum panels electrically powered. Dr. Friedrich Müller's report read, "Not air brakes, they alter lift distribution. Ingenious. It restores elevator authority, a solution we cannot reproduce." He called it a controlled disruption of nature. Germany no longer had the resources, fuel, or time to turn his observation into reality. By the summer of 1944, even genius could not save them. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Lockheed's assembly lines were turning out modified Lightnings faster than the Germans could repair their losses. The war of production was over before it began. In California, under the metallic roar of rivet guns, thousands of workers, mostly women, built Lightning after Lightning. They worked 14-hour days, sometimes sleeping beside the assembly lines. On the inside of each wing panel, they wrote small messages in pencil for the ones who didn't come back. Kelly Johnson rarely spoke. He would simply walk the floor, touching the cold metal of a new wing, and nod. Each flap installed was another apology, another chance to undo the silence that haunted him. By September 1944, the results were undeniable. Kill ratio in the Mediterranean, 4-1. Combat losses cut nearly in half. 0 incidents of control loss in dives. The Lightning was reborn. Not through luck, but through persistence. The same aircraft once dismissed as fragile was now the most stable high-speed fighter in the theater. Data had replaced doubt, and data in war was the purest form of redemption. Inside Luftwaffe squadrons, paranoia spread faster than orders. Pilots whispered about the flaps of death, an American invention that let the enemy follow them into the ground. One pilot at Augsburg wrote home, "They have wings that open, like a devil's trick. There is nowhere to hide." By autumn, morale had collapsed completely. The German Air Force still flew, but it no longer believed. A psychological warfare report from Allied Command noted, "Enemy airmen are avoiding direct combat with Lightning formations. Their will to fight is broken." This was the hell within. A war fought not in the sky, but inside the minds of the men who once ruled it. Captain Robin Olds, whose first combat dive had shattered Müller's illusion of safety, became the living embodiment of the Lightning's rebirth. He flew as if testing both machine and fate. Each time he engaged his flaps, he felt the aircraft steady, as though the air itself had yielded. Olds would later command F-4 Phantom squadrons in Vietnam, but he kept one souvenir for life, the small red switch from his P-38's cockpit. It sat on his desk for 40 years, a reminder that sometimes victory begins with the courage to try again. December 1944, Operation Bodenplatte. The Luftwaffe's last great gamble, hundreds of Bf-19s and FW-19s roared toward Allied airfields in Belgium. They attacked with desperation, and died the same way. In less than 30 minutes, more than 280 German fighters were destroyed. Many never fired a shot. Their old escape tactic betrayed them. When they dived, the P-38Ls followed perfectly, relentlessly. An American pilot recalled, "They dove for safety. We followed them into the earth." On the wreck of one Bf-109 near Eindhoven, investigators found a flight notebook. The final line, written in pencil, "Lightning still follows. Physics has betrayed us." When the fighting stopped, the principle behind the dive recovery flap lived on. The P-47 Thunderbolt adopted a similar system. The P-51 Mustang refined its laminar flow wings using lessons from the Lightning. And when Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in the Bell X-1, he carried the same aerodynamic truth. Manage pressure, don't resist it. A problem born in war had become a foundation of peace. When the war ended, Kelly Johnson declined public honors. He didn't attend the celebrations. Instead, he walked into Lockheed's archives, opened the folder marked Project Dive Flap, and added a final line to the report, "Problem solved. Too late for 300 men." He closed it, placed it on the shelf, and turned off the lights. For him, victory had come, but it had come surrounded by ghosts. At the U.S. Air Force Museum lies a half-written letter from Harold Fisher, the pilot killed one day before the dive flaps were first used in combat. It reads, "If I only had a few more seconds to pull out, it would have been different." Those few seconds were what the flaps gave every pilot after him. In every squadron, they called them Fisher's wings. Each time a P-38 dove and survived, his memory flew with it. War has always been a contest of technology, but sometimes it becomes a test of imagination. The dive recovery flaps work not by fighting the laws of nature, but by bending to them, redirecting force, finding balance where others sought brute strength. It was a lesson written into metal. Control is not defiance, it's understanding. That principle would define the next generation of aircraft and perhaps the next generation of human thought. By 1945, even the German pilots no longer feared being shot down. They feared being chased without escape. The sky, once infinite, had become a prison. And in that prison, every echo of a diving lightning was a reminder that the war they thought they understood had left them behind. The hell they faced was not the enemy. It was the realization that everything they trusted was wrong. For the Americans, the dive recovery flap was a victory of intellect. For the Germans, it was a collapse of faith. But for both, it was a lesson in humanity. Technology could save lives or end them, depending on who reached understanding first. As one Allied engineer later wrote, "We didn't beat them with power. We beat them with thought." After the war, the world moved on to jets, to rockets, to space. But inside every fly-by-wire system, inside every computer correcting airflow at supersonic speed, there is still a trace of that small electric motor that once moved 2 aluminum plates beneath a Lightning's wing. Each time a modern pilot feels his aircraft steady in turbulence, somewhere deep in the machine's logic, the spirit of 1944 still whispers, "Your dive won't kill you anymore." December 1944, the sky over Europe had turned gray, heavy with the smoke of burning oil and frozen breath. Everywhere the war was reaching its breaking point. For the Luftwaffe, the air itself had become a trap. The old tactics, the dives, the sudden escapes, the comforting physics of retreat no longer worked. At a shattered airfield in Austria, Hans Müller sat beside his crippled Messerschmitt. He was alive, but his faith was gone. Each night he still heard the sound of the lightning behind him. Steady, mechanical, unstoppable. The sound of inevitability. By then, the Luftwaffe's defeat was not just written in losses. It was written in silence. In southern Italy, ground crews still worked through the winter, installing dive recovery flaps on older P-38s. They did it quietly, methodically, as if performing a ritual. One mechanic wrote in his notebook, "Every bolt I tighten feels like an apology for the men who never had this." For them, the flaps were not merely a modification, they were redemption, a way to repay the dead. With the only currency left in war, effort. January 1st, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, its final desperate counterattack. Hundreds of fighters thundered through the frozen clouds, heading for Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland. It was meant to be a strike from the shadows. Instead, it became a funeral. As German aircraft dove on their targets, the waiting P-38Ls rose to meet them. When the Messerschmitts tried to escape by diving, as they always had, the Lightnings followed, flaps deployed unflinching. In half an hour, more than 280 German aircraft were destroyed. Many pilots never realized what had changed until it was too late. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff survived the mission. He later wrote, "They dived as we did, faster, deeper, without fear." That was the moment I knew we had lost the war. Not to numbers, but to minds. The P-38L Lightning, final version of the line, could dive at Mach 0.75 without losing control. Its boosted ailerons and powerful twin engines made it one of the fastest, most stable aircraft of the entire war. In the cockpit, the dive flap switch sat near the throttle, a small red guard protecting the simplest miracle in aviation history. Kelly Johnson, watching them take off from Burbank, said quietly, "They're not flying faster. They're flying past our mistakes." He knew what that meant. For every Lightning in the air, there had been one that never came home. The machine had evolved, but only because so many men had not. By the war's end, 10,037 Lightnings had been built. More than 1,700 were lost in combat. Yet after dive flaps were introduced, losses from control failure dropped by nearly half. In sterile numbers, that was success. In human truth, it was the difference between names remembered and names erased. Those who survived knew what it had cost. They didn't speak of triumph. They spoke of time, the time it took to learn, to change, to adapt, and of the hundreds who ran out of time before the lesson arrived. While Europe crumbled, the Pacific burned. At Luzon, Formosa, and Okinawa, P-38Ls flew missions alongside P-51s and P-47s. There, the flaps weren't about survival. They were about supremacy. Major Thomas Maguire and Richard Bonga, America's highest-scoring aces, used the Lightning's new capability to chase Japanese Zeros through vertical dives. That once would have killed them both. Maguire wrote, "You hit the switch and the plane stops fighting you. It becomes something else, a machine that understands." For the Japanese pilots, the old trick of the steep dive was gone. The Zero, light, graceful, once untouchable, was now hunted by a predator that could follow it anywhere. The Lightning had become what it was always meant to be, the weapon of altitude, distance, and endurance. When the shooting stopped, the lessons of the Lightning did not. Engineers from Lockheed, Republic, and North American gathered the data from combat reports and flight logs. Their discoveries shaped the next generation of flight. In 1947, when Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in the Bell X-1, he carried with him the legacy of the P-38's dive recovery flaps, the first practical step toward managing transonic airflow. Yeager later said, "The Lightning showed us what happened before the sound barrier and how to survive it." A device built for war had become the foundation of peace. After victory, Kelly Johnson refused any medals for the flap design. He returned to his office at Lockheed and began a new project, one that would lead to the U-2 and the SR-71 Blackbird. On his desk, there was a photograph of a P-38 in a dive, the flaps open, the sun glinting off its twin booms. He never spoke about it, but every engineer who entered his office saw what the picture meant. Progress and guilt were sometimes the same thing. In post-war Germany, surviving engineers studied wrecked P-38s with fascination. They called the dive flap das elegante Wunder, the elegant miracle. Their findings influenced the design of early jet fighters, the MiG-15 in the east, the F-86 Sabre in the west. Even as the Cold War divided the world, both sides shared the same quiet truth: to master speed, you must first understand failure. In 1946, the U.S. Air Force retired the P-38. The last operational aircraft were parked in hangars, their engines cooling for the final time. To those who had flown them, the Lightning was more than aluminum and engines. It was a memory made of air and fear and trust. Lieutenant Robert Anderson, one of the last Lightning pilots, wrote, "Even years later, I still hear the sound of the dive, the way the air would whistle past the wings. And then that click, the sound of the flaps opening like the plane itself was taking a breath." One surviving P-38, nicknamed Glacier Girl, was pulled from the ice in Greenland decades later. When it flew again in 2002, the dive flaps still worked perfectly. The ghost of 1944 was alive and still obedient. War is often described as a failure of humanity, but within its chaos, there are moments when humanity learns faster than ever before. The P-38 story is one of those moments. It was not the most powerful nor the most beautiful fighter of the war, but it was the one that learned. Compressibility, once a killer, became a teacher. Its solution opened the path to supersonic flight, to jet aircraft, to the space age itself. Kelly Johnson would later tell an interviewer, "No progress ever comes without pain. The flaps were my pain and my redemption." When Robin Olds died in 1983, they placed a real dive flap switch in his coffin, the same kind he flipped over northern Italy in 1944. On his tombstone are the words he once told a young pilot, "Physics wins until you understand it." The P-38's dive flap was proof of that. It wasn't magic. It was understanding. And understanding in war is the most powerful weapon of all. The year 1944 didn't just mark a turning point in the war. It marked the moment when man began to bend the laws of nature to his will. Not by force, but by learning. The Luftwaffe's defeat was not only military, it was intellectual. Their faith in what could not be done was broken by those who refused to stop asking why. The dive recovery flap was born from that question. A question answered by patience, error, and courage. Today, every modern aircraft, from passenger jets to stealth fighters, carries the descendant of the P-38's innovation. Computerized systems now adjust flaps and stabilizers to maintain control at supersonic speeds. But inside that code, inside the hum of the servos, is the same principle Kelly Johnson discovered 80 years ago: shift the pressure and you save the pilot. Every time a pilot pulls out of a dive, every time a jet corrects itself in turbulence, that small sound echoes again. The click of aluminum flaps deploying under a Lightning's wings. War created the P-38's problem. Humanity solved it. A device that once determined life or death became the first step toward everything that came after. Supersonic flight, jet aircraft, space exploration. It was built not from brilliance alone, but from persistence, from the refusal to accept that something could not be fixed. And so each time a modern aircraft steadies itself in a storm, somewhere deep in its systems, the ghost of 1944 still whispers through the circuitry, "Your dive won't kill you anymore." Two thin sheets of aluminum, no heavier than a child's toy, save thousands of men and change forever the way humanity conquers the sky.